Thank you, everyone. And thank you for the Kensington Historical Society for inviting me. My name's Christian McBurney, and I am a Kensington resident as well. And welcome everyone on Zoom too. Thank you for showing up. I'm a book author. I do a lot of books on American Revolution history, and some on Rhode Island history, and many on both. Today's book, I think, is my most important contribution. It's kind of an uncomfortable topic, but and an unusual one. No one's ever written on it before, but I think it's something that is important to understand. If you want to understand about our American Revolution, you have to understand what was going on, everything that was going on, and this was one of these topics that was definitely going on that no one's ever written about. And thank you, Paul Sexton. Is your title President of the Kensington Historical Society? Thank you for inviting me. The contrast is glaring in the extreme. On the one hand, the American Revolutionary War from 1775 to 1783 was a glorious struggle for the causes of freedom, liberty, equality, and the dignity of the individual. Thomas Jefferson's rousing words in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, have inspired millions in our country and across the globe for almost 250 years. And the words resonate today in Ukraine. The word men originally was intended to apply to adult white men, but over time its meaning has been extended to women and persons of all colors, creeds, and races. Yet at the same time that the American Revolutionary War was about to commence, one of the worst tragedies in world history was continuing unabated, and that is the Atlantic slave trade. European and American merchants sent ships across the ocean to purchase African captives and carry them to the Caribbean islands, Brazil, and North America mainland. At the time, Great Britain was dominating the Atlantic slave trade, but other European countries were involved as well, Portugal, France, and even Sweden and Denmark. Between 1771 and 1775 alone, on average each year, more than 90,000 African captives were carried across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World. There, the Africans were forced into a lifetime of unpaid work and permanent bondage, with their children consigned to the same unimaginably horrible fate. The captives were taken away from their families forever, and thousands of them died during the voyage across the Atlantic, what's known as the Middle Passage. It was a horrible, abominable trade, and it's mind-boggling to believe that it ever existed, especially by today's moral standards. Here are some numbers and a chart. You can see from 1642, that's not when the slave trade began, but let's start from there, to 1807, which is when Great Britain stopped its slave trade. America stopped it in 1808. But you can see Great Britain well into the lead. Portugal is strong, number 2. Portugal is really Brazil, so the plantation owners there had a strong demand for African captives. And they started a lot earlier than Britain, and they ended a lot later than Britain. So overall, they were number 1. You can see the United States lagging far behind. You might be surprised at that. We'll talk about that more later. Here's a drawing of a slave ship, a British slave ship, the HMS Blandford. And in the lower right corner is a scene, an African slave trading scene on the coast of Africa. There's a captive being brought out to the ship and kind of celebrating the slave trade. So interesting. Now, in the first 3 quarters of the 18th century, as I said, Great Britain dominated, was the world's leading slave trading country. The year 1775, that was so important for the American Revolution, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, was the zenith of Britain's slave trade. British merchants from Liverpool and Bristol and London sponsored annually about 150 to 200 slave voyages to West Africa and purchased on the average about 40,000 enslaved people. The British vessels transported their captives across the Atlantic Ocean and landed them on British colonial possessions for the most part in the Caribbean islands. In the quarter century prior to the American Revolution, Great Britain's domination of the American slave trade peaked. You can see the chart here, 25-year period from 1771 to 1775 when the Revolutionary War started. Great Britain well in the lead there, and the United States far behind, or what would become the United States. A British slave trading voyage typically had 3 legs, giving rise to the triangular trade. Starting from Britain, the slave ship sailed to African coast carrying goods mainly manufactured by the British, so ammunition, guns, textiles, porcelain. So this supported the British economy. And these goods were used to trade for African captives. Here's another slave trading scene, and this one in color. It's kind of uncommon to have all the slave traders being white. Normally there were intermediaries. There were black African intermediaries and white slave traders as well. Then the ship would carry the captives to the Atlantic through the dreaded Middle Passage, a 6-week voyage or so, from Africa to the Americas. And the ship's destination typically was to a Caribbean possession of Britain, so Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua, other islands. And there, the surviving captives were ultimately sold to plantation owners. Next, the ship's captain purchased sugar and other products created from sugar. What are some two other products created from sugar? Rum, good, that's one. What's rum made from? Molasses, that's right. That was Paul Sexton, president of the Kensington Historical Society. Next, the ship's captain purchased sugar, as I said, and they brought back the sugar to Britain to sell to British wholesalers. Sugar was the key. Europe craved sugar, which was almost unknown to Europeans before the 17th century. English loved sugar in their cookies, cakes, tea, and coffee. Being married to an English woman, I can vouch for that, although I do eat more sugar than she does. The value of sugar imports and related products, molasses and rum, from the British Caribbean far outstripped the value of imports of tobacco from the colonies of Virginia and Maryland, and rice from South Carolina. You might have thought that Virginia and Maryland tobacco was the overwhelming import, but it wasn't. By far, it was sugar. Sugar remained Britain's most valuable import until 1820. Slave labor was indispensable to the production of sugar. Plantation owners in the Caribbean used gangs of enslaved labor to cultivate, harvest, and process the sugar cane into sugar. Once the sugar cane was cut, it had to go to these huge, hot, boiling vats within 24 hours, or the cane would be spoiled. And the planting season would be staggered, so there was basically harvesting going on for 6 months of the year. Really grueling work. All this great increase in our treasure, wrote a British observer in early 1729, proceeds chiefly from the labor of Negroes in the plantations. Now, if slave labor was the key to successful sugar plantations, the African slave trade was the key to the continuation of slave labor. And this was because the plantation owners needed to restock and refresh their slave populations every year by purchasing new captives. An outstanding feature of the British Caribbean plantation slavery in the mid-18th century was that natural births of enslaved people failed to exceed natural and unnatural deaths. This was primarily because of the death rates among the enslaved in the British Caribbean was shockingly high. Poor food, primitive living conditions, and overwork left enslaved people vulnerable to deadly diseases. And the child mortality rate was also abominable. The first 3 years or so of a newly imported enslaved individual's life was called the seasoning period, and that took a heavy toll. Arriving in a weakened state from being on the Middle Passage, the new arrivals had to adjust to new work, new rules, new food, new diseases. An estimated 20% of them died in this seasoning period. Here's a slave trading scene that the prior one was all white people who were doing the trading. Here you have the black free workers, they're called grumetas, rowing the enslaved captives out to the British or European slave ship. You can see the friends and family on shore are grieving. So the Europeans would use as intermediaries. They couldn't do this without some of the help from some of the local black intermediaries. Here's what's called tight packing, a horrible picture of how the captives were shoved and squished inside the lower decks. Here's an autobiography of a gentleman named Olada Equiano. He gave us one of the only recollections of what it was like to go through the Middle Passage. He later gained his freedom and wrote this autobiography and became a well-known abolitionist in London. Now, the British Caribbean planters intentionally made the decision to provide their enslaved populations with minimal food, shelter, and clothing. They made the mind-boggling calculus that so long as the slave trade persisted, it was cheaper for them to buy African captives than to spend money improving the working and living conditions of the enslaved laborers that they already had. As a result of the high mortality rate, among the enslaved populations and the low natural birth rate, British Caribbean planters had to import massive numbers of African captives just to maintain their enslaved populations. So here's the 25-year period before the American Revolution. These are how many imports came into Jamaica: 230,000, Barbados 110,000, so just really big numbers. Perhaps the most devastating statistic is to compare the number of Africans carried into the British Caribbean to their populations when slavery was prohibited. Historian Adam Hochschild writes, when slavery ended in the United States in 1865, less than 500,000 imported over the centuries had grown to a population of nearly 4 million. So that was the natural birth rate. By comparison, notes the same author, when slavery ended in the British Caribbean in 1834, total slave imports of well over 2 million left a surviving population of only about 670,000. After reviewing his statistics, Hochschild concludes the British Caribbean was a slaughterhouse. Readers may be surprised to learn that merchants in what would become the United States and later would become the United States overall played a comparatively small role in the African slave trade. While the slave trade lasted, they carried a total of about 292,000 captive Africans across the Atlantic and outfitted about 2.4% of all slaving voyages. Here's an advertisement from, you can see the name from Charleston, South Carolina. You can see the name Lawrence. He probably handled more enslaved captives than any other North American, and Henry Lawrence. And he later became a president of the Continental Congress during the Revolutionary War. Rhode Island dominated the slave trade among the 13 colonies. More than half of the North American slave trading voyages in colonial times emanated from Rhode Island, with the rest coming from Boston, New York City, and other New England ports. Newport, Rhode Island was by far the dominant slave port of North America. Why did tiny Rhode Island dominate the slave trade? I think it's because Newport had a small hinterland, and some of these other cities had bigger hinterlands. Do you know what a hinterland is, Paul? Suburbs. Close, but I think it is. It's close in areas, and if they're producing a lot of farm products, then the merchants have those farm products that they can trade. A lot of the trade actually was to the British Caribbean to help feed the enslaved populations and the white Europeans there. But Newport didn't have that big area to draw upon like Boston did, or New York had the Hudson Valley, and Philadelphia had all of outside its area had a very successful farming areas. So Rhode Island merchants began looking around and saying, well, we see this molasses being produced in the British Caribbean. If we buy that and then distill it in Newport and Providence, Rhode Island, into rum, then we can sell it. That's what they did. And they sold a lot of the rum in New England. But about 1/3 of it, it was sold to as merchandise to trade for North African African captives. Excuse me. The Rhode Island traders on the African coast were so prominent with their rum that they became known as rum men. Now, while Rhode Island, and I'll just show this one painting, great painting called Merchants at Sea Captains at Suriname. And supposedly there are 4 different future Rhode Island governors in the painting. Now, that's in the St. Louis Museum. While Rhode Island was a small player in the worldwide slave trade prior to the American Revolution, carrying on the average about 2,400 African captives per year, As the years and decades went by, it turned into a pretty big number. In all, over 59,000 Africans were involuntarily taken aboard Rhode Island ships in the colonial period, and the human suffering that these Rhode Island slavers caused African captives and their families left behind is impossible to measure. But matters were beginning to change. The American Revolution was a crucial catalyst for the worldwide anti-slavery movement. It was, in fact, prior to the Civil War, the American Civil War, the most important event in America in promoting the anti-slavery cause. When the rebellion against Crown rule began, there was little anti-slavery activity anywhere in the world, even in Britain. There was a little bit, but not a lot. Britain's anti-slavery movement really didn't get going until 1787. As with any great worldwide movement, the anti-slavery campaign made slow progress, but the American Revolution definitely brought significant progress. Before the war, slavery existed in every northern colony, in every one of the 13 colonies, including all of the northern colonies. After the war, mostly through legislation, each state in the North eventually ended the institution of slavery, and all states banned the importation of African captives. This was probably the first time in world history where this happened. The American Revolution thus proved to be a major leap forward for the cause of ending the African slave trade as well as slavery itself. But slavery continued in the South, including here in Maryland. This is still the South. There was still a long road ahead to ending slavery and treating black people as political and social equals. Now, with American colonists denouncing a British plot to enslave us, you're trying to enslave us by imposing taxes without representation, it's not surprising that some of the patriots looked around and said, hey, wait a minute, we're actually enslaving real people. As early as 1763, the great patriot orator James Otis of Massachusetts, in an influential pamphlet arguing that colonists ought not to be taxed without their consent, asserted that there were laws higher than acts of Parliament. And while not necessary to do so to make his point, Otis delved into race relations. He exclaimed, "The colonists are by the law of nature freeborn, as indeed are all men, white or black. Does it follow that 'tis right to enslave a man because he is black?" Speaking of the African slave trade, he said, "Nothing can be better said in favor of a trade that is the most shocking violation of the law of nature." This is the cover of a pamphlet that I found in the Library of Congress. It was one of the most popular in colonial times, and it was by a Massachusetts Reverend, Congregationalist Reverend Jonathan Allen. And his main point was that the Rhode Island attack on the Gaspee was an important act against tyranny. But in the fourth edition, he adds 3 or 4 paragraphs on how slavery and the slave trade should be banned. So this is the first time where this kind of thing happened. And you actually had, before then, Congregationalists and other preachers weren't really getting into it, except for the Quakers. The Quakers were early in trying to promote the end of slavery and the slave trade, but they were not an influential sect. So finally, the bigger sects were getting into it. In the lead up to the American Revolution, most legislatures in the 13 colonies passed laws to limit the importation of African enslaved people into their colonies. And they didn't, for various reasons. In the North, it was more for humanitarian reasons. In the South, it was in Virginia and Maryland. Their farms were not as successful economically. The land was being farmed out, and they had an excess number of enslaved people, so they wanted to limit it not for humanitarian purposes, but to keep their prices high. But still, that's a good thing not to have more migrations. But the government in London refused all of those laws and revoked all of those laws because they didn't want to have any law that would interfere with the slave trade. My new book brings together the glory of the American Revolutionary War and the horror of the African slave trade together in one tale. This tale is told through the extraordinary voyage of the ship called the Marlborough, a Rhode Island privateer, on its voyage to West Africa. Now, why would a privateer sail to faraway West Africa. Most of the American privateers during the war would sail down to the Caribbean and capture sugar ships, or they would go to up the coast of Canada and capture military ships coming from Britain that were going to Quebec. But Africa, no privateer was known to sail there before. The story starts in Providence, Rhode Island, with John Brown, the main investor and mastermind behind the voyage. This is not the same John Brown from the Civil War, of course. Brown was a member of a famous Rhode Island merchant family. Matter of fact, his house is now the headquarters for the Rhode Island Historical Society. John Quincy Adams once called that house the finest mansion in North America. In 1772, Brown organized and led the burning of the British revenue cutter Gaspee, arguably the first act of violent resistance leading to the American Revolution. He was also an early investor in an iron foundry that made cannon. And he would sell these cannon to lots of privateers and to the Continental Navy. And he generated more profits by being a military contractor with the Continental Congress. He would go overseas and buy ammunition and military supplies. Here's a portrait or miniature by Edward Malbone, done about 1794. This is held by the New York Historical Society. In 1776 and 1777, Brown got really rich investing in privateering. During the war, the Continental Navy, the equivalent of what's now the U.S. Navy, was no match for the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy, Britain's Royal Navy, was by far the most powerful maritime force in the world. America's most effective weapon at sea by far was privateering, the operation of privately owned commerce raiders. And so from British ships, Americans captured gunpowder, weapons, food, blankets, and other supplies desperately needed by the Continental Army and state militias. Privateers were not pirates. Pirates operated outside of any government oversight and solely for their own purposes. Privateers were sanctioned by the government to attack only enemy shipping. They couldn't attack ships that were neutral. Sometimes the Marlborough would be sailing and they would see a sail in the distance and they would go after the sail and they were all excited. Then they would find out that ship was from Spain or Holland, and they were all bummed out because they were neutral countries and they couldn't attack them. Once an enemy vessel was captured, the captain of the privateer would typically select from his ship a prize master and a small crew to sail that ship back to a friendly port, typically to a U.S. port. And there, the prize would undergo an Admiralty court proceeding. The Admiralty court would have a jury, and the jurors would decide, hey, is this an enemy vessel? Was this vessel properly taken? If it was, then the ship and its cargo would be sold at auction. And the investors would get 50%, and the ship's crew and captain would split the other 50%. Oh, here's a map of Providence, and John Brown's house and wharf is down there. That's part of Narragansett Bay. Here's an advertisement from a Baltimore newspaper of a Baltimore privateer that just returned with a captured prize, and it's announcing that it's going to auction the ship and the cargo that it captured for sale. Now, many who enlisted with an American privateer had mixed motives of patriotism and economic self-interest. Christopher Prince, when he joined the crews of several American privateers, admitted that he had two motives in mind. One was for the freedom of my country, and the other was to enjoy the luxuries of life. If privateersmen were honest with themselves, they would admit that the decision to go privateering was primarily financially oriented. Continental Navy and Army officers bemoaned the thousands of sailors who would go in these privateers instead of signing up for Washington's Army and Valley Forge and that kind of thing. Yet privateers sometimes engaged in fierce contests with Royal Navy ships, as well as British and Loyalist privateers. The captain of the Marlborough, George W. Babcock, in his career never shrank from combat with the enemy. He fought 5 fierce battles with well-armed enemy ships that are described in the book. Now, in the early years of the war, the Royal Navy failed to devote substantial resources to protect the British merchant fleet. So American privateers easily captured hundreds of British merchant ships sailing between Britain and the Caribbean islands and Canada. Soon, Providence, Rhode Island became awash in surplus goods and supplies. The Reverend Ezra Stiles from Newport wrote that some 40 prizes had been brought into Providence by October 1776, all but 3 of which had been engaged in the sugar trade between the Britain and the Caribbean colonies. Young John Howland returned to Providence in early 1777. He had served with Washington's army in New Jersey and suffered terribly. They had little food, little clothing. And he wrote, "The year 1776 was mostly employed in privateering, and many whom I had left in poor circumstances were now rich men. The wharves in Providence were crowded with large ships from Jamaica and other islands loaded with rich products." Now, while privateering was risky, the rewards could be phenomenal. I did a study of John Brown's privateering, and he had this one privateer that only had 6 to 8 cannon and 30 to 40 men. And yet, and that cost about 3,300 pounds for him to buy and outfit. And yet, if he made a single capture of a British sugar ship, that could be worth 9,000 pounds. Today's value, more than $400,000. So a single capture could pay, almost 2 to 3 times of what he put into the privateer. He invested in 11 privateers in 1776 and 1777, and he, needless to say, became rich. But there were warning signs ahead. The days of the easy conquests of 1776 ended. Powerful British Royal Navy ships started to do convoys of merchant ships, and so it made it harder for privateers to make captures. When crews of privateers were captured, they were brought to horrible prisons, many in New York City. And probably about half the deaths that Americans experienced in the war were in these New York prison camps. And the vast majority of those men were privateersmen. Brown decided in the second half of 1777 that with his new wartime profits, he could afford to build and invest in a new privateer that carried at least 20 cannon. That was a big, 20 cannon was a lot for a privateer. But he could outgun a lot of the British ships, but not the British 32 gun ships. Those were definitely more powerful than his ship. So and there were a lot of them down in the Caribbean and the Canadian coast. What to do? He had the idea, I'm going to send my privateer to the west coast of African coast. Brown figured correctly that the Royal Navy was overstretched. It had to transport the British Army in North America, seek out privateers on the North American coast, blockade some of the ports, including New York and Newport, but most importantly, keep ships back in case there was an invasion by France across the English Channel. Excuse me. Now, it took an exceptional privateer investor and a bold man to decide to send a privateer to Africa, but there were a lot of bold investors and bold captains in New England. What gave Brown the edge was his familiarity with the African slave trade. For one, he was from Rhode Island, so he could talk to returning slave ship captains and find out, hey, is the British Royal Navy sending warships to patrol the West African coast? And he found out the answer was no. Second, Brown himself was an experienced African slave trader. He personally invested in 2 slave trading voyages in colonial times, one in 1763 and another in 1769. The first one was was the Sally, commanded by Esek Hopkins. Now, he was one of the Browns' favorite ship captains. He was not a slave trade captain, but they couldn't find one, so they said, hey, can you do this for us? He would become the first commander-in-chief of the Continental Navy during the Revolutionary War. But this slave trading voyage on the Sally turned into one of the most deadly in North American history. Of the 196 captives that Hopkins purchased, 109 perished during the voyage. A slave trading voyage was daunting in part because the slave ship loaded with goods to trade for African captives was typically not large enough to carry all the food and water that was necessary to support the crew. So the captains knew they had to trade with local African chieftains for more food and water. That was a daunting prospect for a lot of Americans, but not for Brown, because he was familiar with the slave trading. Now, was Brown motivated to attack Britain, the world's leading slave trading country, out of humanitarian impulses? Clearly no. He did want to attack the British and harm them economically, and the slave trade was an important part of their economy. But at the same time, he wanted to earn profits doing so. A privateer sent to Africa could attack and plunder slave trading posts and forts established by the British slave traders. So if you were a British slave trading ship, well, Hopkins's problem was he would go from small village to small village, do some negotiations with local chieftains, and he would get 2 or 3 at a time. But that took a long time. Meanwhile, the ones that he did have were below decks in these steaming, horrible conditions, and that's why a lot of them died. But British would establish these forts, so they would collect the captives from interior tribes and hold them at the forts, and when a British slave ship came by, they could sell them all at once. So it's much more efficient for a British slave trading ship. But Brown knew, well, you have to have the merchandise at that fort in order to trade for the captives, so he could capture that merchandise. And if he was lucky, there might be some captives already there that he could also capture. British slave ships with human cargo on board could also be seized, whose captains would be surprised by the appearance of a strong American privateer so far from its home port. If Brown was really fortunate, he figured his privateer could capture a large British slave ship filled with African captives, ready to sail for the Caribbean islands. In such a situation, the slave traders would be ready to cash in. They just have to cross the Atlantic for a 6-week voyage, and they could cash in. But Brown's privateer instead could step in, make the capture, put it on a prize crew, and have that ship sail to a safe port, Charleston, South Carolina, or Savannah, Georgia, or a French Caribbean port at the time, Martinique or Guadeloupe. There, the enslaved Africans could be sold on board, Then Brown and his officers and other investors basically became slave traders themselves. A few other patriots had considered an expedition to Africa, and one of them was John Paul Jones. He is the Continental Navy's greatest hero, and there's a lovely crypt of him at Annapolis at the Navy Academy. While stationed in Newport in October 1776, Jones recommended to Congress that he command a small expedition of Continental Navy ships to sail to the West African coast and attack British slave trading interests. He was sure that his ships could carry all before them and give a blow to the English-African slave trade, which would not soon recover. Now, the expedition didn't get off the ground for various reasons, but Jones knew what he was talking about. As a young man on his first sailing voyage out of Whitehaven, England, it was on a slave trading voyage to Jamaica, and then he took one other one as well. Brown was also aware from reading newspapers that beginning in early 1777, American privateers started to capture British slave ships. In most cases, American privateers would capture these British slave ships just as they were about to arrive in the British Caribbean, Barbados or Jamaica or Antigua. They would come out from the safe ports in the French Mediterranean, at Martinique or Guadeloupe, and make the captures, and then they would bring the captured ships back to the French ports, and French plantation owners would then purchase the captives. Again, at this point, the American privateersmen became slave traders. Brown had a new 20-gun, 3-masted brig constructed in Providence in 1777. He named it the Marlborough, after the Duke of Marlborough, an ancestor of Winston Churchill. Here's a model of what the ship likely looked at. This model is in Hamburg, Germany, but it's a great-looking model. To make the voyage a success, Brown had to find a courageous ship captain. He found one in George Waite Babcock of Exeter, Rhode Island. Now, the township of Exeter is landlocked. It's known for its, back then, for small stony farms. But it was close to a small, thriving port, now called Wickford in North Kingstown. And Babcock moved to Wickford, and he formed this outfit of independent rangers to kind of tamp down a Tory loyalist uprising in that area. So he showed some leadership skills. He also served as a privateer officer, second lieutenant on some privateering voyages, including one for Brown. And Babcock would turn out to be a bold and sensible commander of the Marlborough and one of the top privateer captains of the war. He hired most of his officers and crew from North Kingstown and Exeter, so men who knew and trusted him signed up with him. Here's the commission for the Marlborough signed by George Babcock and John Brown. Now, here's an interesting painting. Why am I showing this painting? Because on American privateers, there were black sailors who were privateersmen. On one roll of a Rhode Island privateer of 60 sailors, at least 3 were black sailors. Now, I actually own this painting. My father bought it in 1971. And that was just when black history was starting to make a comeback. And it's appeared in many, it's very unusual to have a black figure from the Revolutionary War, and this image has appeared in a number of history books, and it's been shown in museums. My father got a little suspicious, so he had it x-rayed. Turns out the black paint was fake. And it's actually a portrait of a white, probably a white French sailor. Everything else is 18th century. But someone put on the black paint. Now, my father only bought it for $1,100, and there was no one making a killing on this. And I'm not sure why the guy did it, probably to promote black history, that's my guess. But it's still a valuable image, because there are so few images of blacks from this period in the Revolutionary War. So I do plan to donate it to the Newport Historical Society at some point. And the affair even got written up in the New Yorker magazine. So here's a map of Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island, one of the great bays in the Northeast. Not quite as great as Chesapeake Bay, but it's still good. I think the sailing there is better than, there's more constant wind in Narragansett Bay than Chesapeake Bay. I'm sorry for Annapolis people, but those are the 2 great sailing centers right now in the Northeast. But the Newport was at the time occupied by the British. And they had Navy ships. You can see them stationed throughout the channels. So Providence is up here. Brown had to get, out of the Narragansett Bay, which he chose the channel on the far right, which was the most shallow channel. So it didn't have the big British ships there. But he also, he escaped on a cold, windy night. Actually, it was Christmas Eve of 1777. But he actually got grounded on a sandbar. That could have ruined the whole voyage right there. A lot of times when ships got grounded, they would start throwing stuff off, like heavy cannon and food, but that would have ended his voyage. But he was able to get himself off, and then he outran a British warship. He then sailed to Martha's Vineyard, picked up 24 more sailors, and then on January 2nd, 1778, they were off to West Africa. Thus began the extraordinary voyage of the Marlborough to Africa and back. And what we know primarily about this voyage is from a ship's log kept by a guy named John Linscomb Boss, excuse me, from Newport, Rhode Island. He would dutifully write in every day what happened in the journal. Here's a cover of the journal. And I was fortunate to get a copy of it from the Navy History Department. I actually heard about it from a Navy history historian at a Revolutionary War conference, and I said, wait a minute, this privateer is going to Africa, and it's from Rhode Island. That I do a lot of writing on Rhode Island. I knew immediately then that no one had done a book on it, and that was going to be my next book. I tried to find the original of it. It's in the Morristown National Historical Park. So I call them up, and they look for it, but they can't find it. That's a shame. It was probably either stolen or it's just lost. in their collections. The guy didn't think anyone looked at it since 1950 or 60 or so, so it has been a while. But it's always fun to feel the original, and maybe you find something new and different. There are a few drawings in it as well. Now, while I've spent a lot of time here tonight giving you background, most of the book, 2/3 of it, is about the voyage itself of the Marlborough to Africa and back, how it was organized and thought out, what happened on the voyage, the fascinating people they came across on the voyage, and the prizes and the enslaved people that they captured. I don't have time to go through all those details tonight. You have to read the book to find out. Suffice it to say that it was a remarkable journey, and from Brown and Babcock's viewpoint, a successful one. Here are some of the notable events in short form, after I have another drink of water. The New England privateersmen were able to sack one of the top British forts in Africa, slave trading forts. They also captured several armed British slave ships and sailed them as prizes back to North America. One of them, when seized, had more than 310 captives on board, just about ready to sail back to the British Caribbean, just as John Brown hoped. Babcock captured several British slave ships with both African captives and free American workers on board. And consistent with his privateering commission, he kept the captives as cargo, human cargo, but he released the free workers. During their time on the West African coast, Babcock worked with several African leaders who cooperated with the New Englanders. One of them was named King Tom. He had served as an intermediary for European and American slave ship captains for decades. Several British slave ship captains were captured by Babcock, and they greedily agreed to cooperate with the Americans and gave Babcock valuable information so they could get their ships back. But they essentially committed treason against Britain to do that. Here's a great image of the maritime world off the west coast of Africa, and it was dominated by these canoes, powered by the human Africans. They would bring the captives out, they would bring the food and water out as well, and engage in trading with the ships. Here's a pen and ink done by a British slave ship captain. These on the left and the center are Fonte warriors, and they're bringing back on the right, you can see the captives that are yoked together, and they're marching them to the coast where they'll be sold to African intermediaries, and then those, or British slave ships, forts, excuse me, and then from there sold to British slave ships. Most of the captives were as a result of wars, internal wars among the Africans. In the area where Babcock was operating, there was a large Muslim army that was attacking pagans in the interior, trying to convert them to Muslim religion, and that's where hundreds of thousands of captives came from over decades. Here's a picture of the British slave fort that was sacked by the Marlborough, called at the Isle de Los, off of Guinea-Bissau area. Here's a map that I had created showing the voyage of the Marlborough and also the voyages of some of the prize ships that they captured, the slave ships as prize ships. There are a number of original documents, and this was one of them. I found this doing a Google search. You can do amazing things on Google. And this was found in an auction site and traced it now to the Cornell Library. These are orders by George Babcock. You can see his signature at the lower level there, to his prize ship captain and crew. This was about the ship that had 310 captives on board, saying, I want you to take it to Charleston or Savannah or to the French Caribbean. He was dictating the terms at which the captives should be sold, and taking back notes and that kind of thing. Now, the Marlborough damaged the British slave trade more than any other American privateer. And in the last chapter of my book, I argue that the actions of the officers and sailors of the Marlborough, as well as those of other American privateersmen who intercepted British slave ships at sea, had a stunning unintended effect. the British slave trade by 1778 had not only been disrupted, it had virtually collapsed. American privateersmen interfered with the conduct of the British slave trade to such an extent that British slave merchants substantially reduced their investments in African slave trading voyages. So these merchants were suffering these losses to American privateersmen and said, well, they were very expensive projects. They would last over a year. I'm not going to invest any more money in it, they decided. By 1778, the reduction was more than 70%. As a result, during the early years of the Revolutionary War, the number of enslaved Africans forcibly shipped across the Atlantic Ocean declined dramatically, perhaps by as much as 60,000, and probably more. So that's a lot of Africans who were not brought over across the Atlantic. This is the first book to detail and emphasize the role of American privateers in disrupting the slave trade. One of my exhibits, or appendices, I go through 41 captures of British slave ships by American privateers with more than 11,000 African captives on board. So a lot of the British slave trade historians that I shared my manuscript with were surprised at this new information. On the other hand, on a personal level, the Man of the Marlborough and other American privateersmen desperately wanted to seize British slave ships filled with enslaved Africans for their own selfish and awful interests. When they did capture British slave ships, they became slave traders, hoping to sell their captives for as high a price as possible. They did not show compassion for the hundreds of captives crammed on board the British slave ship, or worry about the trauma that the enslaved Africans had already undergone. Instead, the Americans sought to treat the captives the same way as any non-human cargo seized on board an enemy ship. While such a motive at the time was not seen as offensive by many Americans, by today's standards, it is repugnant. The unintended beneficiaries of this war at sea on the slave trade were the Africans, who otherwise might have been sold to British slave ship trade captains and carried across the Atlantic Ocean. The officers and sailors on the Marlborough and other American privateersmen who intercepted British slave ships did not have the humanitarian goal of helping Africans, far from it. Still, their actions did substantially reduce the African slave trade and prevent tens of thousands of Africans from becoming enslaved in the New World. This was a positive impact, even if the reduction was temporary and unintended. The privateersmen can thus be viewed as heroes or villains, or both. Thank you.